where did the piece come from? Because obviously we know when we first encountered it, which was at Southampton, but I wasn't aware how long it had existed before that, or how long the idea had existed before that.
I've been playing around with electronic drum kits for a while. Through one of the places I work at, we're often using electronic drum kits and changing what sounds they produce and how they're used in different contexts as part of the practice with the students. And so I'd kind of got involved with working with electronic drum kits during that time. And when this opportunity presented itself, of which I was very excited, I thought this was a possibility to reconceive of the electronic drum kit as a potential kind of proxy piano. And so I think it was around that time that I started setting up the drum kit to try things out. And I tend to, with my work, set up the instruments that I want to compose for, to try them out, to explore what they can do, and to trial things, record it, go back, have a listen, see what's come out of it, and then go back and try some more things out. So there's a kind of physical experimentation with the kind of instrument as an object itself. So I don't think there was anything more conceptual than that, simply a kind of organic growth of trying things out.
Although the piece's origin may not have been, it didn't come from a conceptual place or a kind of overarching concept in that way, where you've ended up is a piece that it is kind of high concept in a sense because of the interplay between the piano and the drum kit and examining their roles, perhaps. I don't know. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
no, I think that's a good point. And I think when I say there was no particular concept for this piece, I think that's true, but there is perhaps a kind of guiding principle to the work I produce. And I think what I'm really interested in is exploring that relationship between instrumentalist and instrument, and seeing how we can listen to the instrument in different ways without necessarily taking the instrumentalists' technique that they spent years and years practicing, and providing some interventions which disrupt that. I'm interested in seeing what will happen if we place the instrumentalist in a position of doing what they do really well. And we all love watching these kind of performances of people doing what they do really well, but hearing it in a slightly different way through the use of some sort of electronic technological intervention. So there's a change in the signal chain a little bit further down the line from that kind of the interface between the instrument as an object and the instrumentalist.
Almost like you're kind of taking the idea of an extended technique, but you're moving where that disjunct occurs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that, the extended techniques I think it's a really great idea because this is a kind of pursuit of new sounds or new ways of hearing an instrument which is established. And I think that it is that kind of philosophy, that idea of, okay, what can we do that's going to push this into a new listening space, and to think about it so that those sounds that we hear are familiar, but at the same time new. So there's a kind of a simultaneity there.
Yeah, so perhaps we should actually... Will you explain what the full setup of the piece is and how it works? Because we never really set that up.
Sure. Yeah. So the only adaptation to the piano is the inclusion of two pedals. And they are electronic piano pedals, so they are a continuous depressed pedal trigger. And those two pedals activate a arpeggiated single note. Each pedal is at a different pitch. The first pedal is just a repeated arpeggiated note, but the second one is slightly more interesting in the fact that it has an LFO, which changes the rate of the arpeggiator.
What does that stand for, Olly?
Low frequency oscillator, which is changing the rate of the arpeggiation so it gets faster and slower in a kind of controlled, nice, smooth way. And then the electronic drum kit is a standard, I would say, electronic drum kit setup. So you've got a kick, snare, crash, ride, hi-hats, and then a couple of toms. And each one of those pads is linked to a piano note. But there's also an audio effect on each one of those pads. And the audio effects are generally kinds of delays or resonators or reverbs. but the audio effects are quite simple. I have an interest in using technology, but I wouldn't describe myself as an expert at all. And so my interest wanes when it gets to the kind of, the minutiae detail of how these things are constructed. And so I think, if I showed you what it was, it would probably be a little bit underwhelming. But I'm not necessarily interested in the audio effects and like innovation with audio effects themselves, but the purpose of them within the piece and how they're used and what the effect of having them within the sound world is.
Coming back to the idea of the cultural implications of what a particular compositional decision is, thinking about the drum kit, I don't know, for me as a drum kit player, well, wait, we'll cut that out. For me as a percussionist,
be bold.
Yeah, right. For me as a drum kit virtuoso, for me as a percussionist, who started as a drummer, watching someone play, even a silent drum kit, I have a kind of ghostly audio image of what that will sound like, and I imagine that's not exclusive to people who play the drums. It's kind of, we've all seen someone either playing a drum kit or messing about on one. So there's a kind of there's like a shadow of an acoustic memory that happens when you see someone doing that. But with your piece, what it's actually generating in terms of sound is piano sound. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of reflect on the dramatic purpose of that, or like whether that residual kind of sonic image, whether that has a role in the way you've conceived the piece in its minutiae and so on?
Yeah, for sure. And that I think is really important to the piece. So earlier on, we were talking about the kind of the relationship between the instrument and the performer, and the kind of established techniques that you use on that particular instrument. And so drum kit technique is a very particular thing, even though it crosses perhaps different styles. But there is something there which is distinctly drum kit based. And what we get in the piece, I think, or what I'm hoping to achieve, is this kind of confluence between the sound of the piano and the sound of the drum kit. Although we don't hear the sounds of the drum kit, we still get the sense of the drum kit because of the patterns that are produced by the drummer or the percussionist within the piece. And so, especially as it gets towards the end of the composition, we get these drum patterns, which are distinctly drum patterns, but we hear the piano, and so we get this kind of blend, I guess, between these two techniques.
Yeah, and in fact, a lot of the piano writing is not pianistic in the normal sense. It feels like the two instruments are kind of coming towards each other, one from the material side and one from the side of the sound that it produces.
For sure, yeah. I think that engagement with the kind of the timbre of the two instruments and also the rhythms that are coming from the drum kit are explored across both instruments. And so there's a section in the piece where the rhythms you get from the arpeggiator and the rhythms you get from the tremolo on the drum kit and the piano, they kind of all blend, and so we get a kind of a textural layer where different rhythms emerge and disappear and come back. And on the piano, that is a very kind of simple 2-note refrain which goes back and forth. And like you say, I don't think traditionally pianistic, but its function within the piece is more of a kind of textural one, where we see and hear, well, we don't see, we hear these kind of rhythms emerge and disappear.
So a loose theme of this whole concert program is the kind of erosion of identity. How do you think your piece relates to that theme, if you think it relates to it at all?
So I suppose that the piece engages with this opposition, which we've talked about briefly, which is of human and technology. And human and technology, this is something which has been definitely at the forefront of people's minds for the last year. So human relationships mediated through technology, computer screens, and how that's changed the way that we experience reality, but also how we engage with the basic kind of social functions as humans. And I think that there is a kind of parallel. There's a similarity here between this, the rise of digital instruments. Digital instruments are obviously very powerful, really effective, a kind of domain of music, musical objects. But there's also a limitation, which is down to the way that it operates. And so, one of the things which I think we really played around with in workshops was the sensitivity of the pads in the drum kit. And because it's MIDI, everything is 0 to 127, so that each pad will produce a number between 0 and 127 when struck. And so if this was a perfectly amazing pad, then you would have every single gradation of number. But it's not. These numbers are tend to be categorized into groups which are much larger, which means you probably only have kind of 4 dynamics or 5. And when you compare this with an acoustic instrument like the piano, then all of those nuances, all of that change between the sound of the hammer onto the string is so different. And so there is, in a sense, this kind of use of digital instruments as a substitute for acoustic instruments, which I think is always going to be difficult, because the digital instrument just doesn't engage with that kind of sound making property that an acoustic instrument does. And so what's interesting is how we use digital instruments perhaps in different ways. So not as a substitute, but maybe as a kind of parallel, or I think you used the word shadow earlier. I really like that. So it's a great word to use. Or maybe just as something completely different. And I think when we started off in this pandemic, not to get too grandiose, but we were using Zoom as well as a substitute for any kind of human relationship. And now I'm sure I'm not the only person that started off filled with kind of like, yeah, let's meet on Zoom and we'll have a chat. And then a couple of months in, these started to fade away because they're just not good substitutes. You couldn't get the things that you wanted from these kind of conversations. And so I think perhaps there is something there about a kind of digital world and an analog world, and how these bits of technology are used.
Mm. Yeah, and those 2 poles, the analog and the digital, are kind of physically instantiated on stage by the 2 instruments, right?
Yeah.
There's also this thing where they, as we've discussed, they kind of invade each other's identity a little bit, or each other's material.
Yeah, for sure.
Is that where the title comes from?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the idea of an alias, I think, is quite common in computer terminology, and thinking of the electric drum kit as an alias. So it's quite a direct title in that sense.
This conversation is making the piece sound very serious and conceptual, despite what you said at the start. And not to say that it's an unserious piece, but it has a comic element to it, I would say. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that I like pieces which kind of stray into that territory, where there is a kind of you spent all this time producing a very considered setup, and I think part of the process for me is part of the compositional act is composing what is going to be performed on, and the space in which we hear it. And you're right, that can be quite serious, and I really like it when these things can be reimagined to kind of move into new territories. And I think that by the time we get to the end of the piece, there are definitely references there that perhaps are unexpected from the start of the piece. And yeah, this moves us into a more a lighter kind of mood. But I think with all my compositions, there is a sense of comedy or fun about some aspects of it. Well, it's not laugh out loud, but it's I think there is a kind of knowingness, hopefully.
Yeah. Or a play with
that's better.
with expectations and so on. I think I was when I was learning the piece and it got to that first, digga 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 thing, I think I was laughing a little bit.
I mean, there is something
pretty funny.
there is something quite funny about seeing somebody do something that's so energetic that produces something that feels quite, I don't know, marked in a different way. And so those, one note being repeated again and again is not commensurate with a big snare roll, which we normally would see in kind of rock music contexts. And so, yeah, I definitely, I'm glad that brought a smile to your face. I would hate to think that was, just hard work.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I think the smile disappeared when I saw the last page. But thank you very much, Olly.
Thank you.
And thanks for your piece. It's a wonderful, wonderful composition, and it was pretty obvious from the first, time of looking through it when we started working on it, whenever that was, 2 years ago. So thank you very much.